The sun was setting over the small town, casting long shadows across the dusty roads. It was one of those quiet evenings where nothing seemed out of place, except for Ethan Whitmore. He sat alone at the kitchen table in his rented apartment, staring blankly at an envelope that had arrived earlier that day. The handwriting on it was unmistakable. It belonged to his mother. She had passed away just 2 weeks ago, leaving behind not only memories but also questions about what would happen to the family home. Ethan wasn't close to anyone anymore, especially not his older brother Caleb. Caleb had always been the loud one, the confident one, the kind of guy who could charm anyone into doing what he wanted. Their father's death years ago had left the family business in Caleb's hands, and since then, things between them had grown colder than winter, frost. While Caleb thrived as the boss of their construction company, Ethan drifted away, choosing a simpler life far from the chaos of bulldozers and blueprints. But now, sitting there with that envelope in front of him, Ethan felt uneasy. Something told him this letter wouldn't bring good news. Still, he opened it carefully, unfolding the crisp paper inside. As he read through the lines, his heart sank, and then raced all at once. His mother had written a new will before she died, naming him as the sole heir to everything. The house, the land, even the old barn out back. Everything. It didn't make sense. Why would she leave it all to him? Ethan hadn't lived in that house for years. He barely spoke to Caleb these days, let alone visited the property. And yet here it was, clear as day, signed and dated by their mother herself. A wave of guilt washed over him. Had she known something no one else did? Or was this her way of making sure the family stayed connected after she was gone? Before Ethan could process it all, his phone buzzed. It was a text from someone in town, a neighbor. "Hey, you should come see what's happening at your place," it read. Ethan frowned. What could possibly be going on? Curiosity tugged at him until he couldn't ignore it anymore. Grabbing his jacket, he hopped into his beat-up truck and headed toward the old homestead. When he turned onto the dirt road leading up to the house, his jaw dropped. There they were. 5 massive bulldozers parked right outside the gate, engines idling like hungry beasts ready to pounce. Men in hard hats milled around, checking equipment and talking loudly. Ethan froze, gripping the steering wheel tightly. This couldn't be real. Not the house. Not the place where he'd spent countless summers running barefoot through the fields, where every creaky floorboard held a memory. He got out of the truck slowly, his boots crunching against the gravel. Driveway. One of the workers noticed him and walked over. "Can I help you?" the man asked gruffly. This is my family's property," Ethan stammered, pointing at the house. "What are you doing here?" The worker shrugged. "Orders from Caleb Whitmore. We're tearing it down tomorrow morning." Ethan's stomach churned. Of course, Caleb must have assumed he'd inherit everything. After all, he ran the family business. He made the big decisions. To Caleb, demolishing the old house probably seemed like progress, a chance to build something modern and profitable. But to Ethan, it felt like erasing history, like ripping apart the very fabric of who they were as a family. Desperation clawed at him. He needed proof, fast. If Caleb thought he owned the place, there was no telling how quickly he'd move to destroy it. Without wasting another second, Ethan jumped back into his truck and sped off toward the lawyer's office. His mind raced with thoughts of his mother, the house, and the promise he'd made to her years ago, to protect it no matter what. By the time he reached the lawyer's office, it was late evening. The streets were empty, and the building looked dark and unwelcoming. Ethan knocked anyway, hoping someone might still be inside. Luck was on his side. The lawyer answered the door, looking surprised but willing to listen. "I need to see the will," Ethan said breathlessly. "My mother's will, please." The lawyer hesitated but eventually led him to a desk cluttered with papers. After some searching, he pulled out a folder and handed it to Ethan. Inside was the official document confirming what Ethan already knew. He was the rightful owner of the property. Relief flooded through him, but it was short-lived. The lawyer explained that while the will was legitimate, The paperwork hadn't been fully processed yet. Until then, Ethan couldn't legally stop Caleb from moving forward with his plans. Ethan left the office feeling defeated, but determined. He glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. Tomorrow morning, those bulldozers would roar to life unless he found a way to stop them. For the first time in years, Ethan realized he couldn't do this alone. He needed help, not just to save the house, but to remind everyone, including himself, why it mattered so much. As he drove back home, the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on his shoulders. The house wasn't just bricks and wood. It was a symbol of love, resilience, and family ties. And if Caleb tried to tear it down, he'd be destroying more than just walls. He'd be obliterating the last piece of their shared past. Little did Ethan know, the battle ahead would test him in ways he never imagined. But one thing was certain. He wouldn't let his brother win without a fight. The next morning, Ethan woke up with a knot in his stomach. He hadn't slept much, not after spending hours staring at the ceiling, replaying every possible scenario in his head. The bulldozers were still there. They hadn't started tearing down the house yet, but time was running out. He knew Caleb wouldn't wait forever. His brother wasn't the kind of man to hesitate once he set his mind on something. Ethan got dressed quickly, throwing on an old flannel shirt and jeans. He didn't bother eating breakfast. His appetite had vanished. As he drove toward the family property, the rising sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, but Ethan barely noticed. All he could think about was the house. The thought of it being reduced to rubble made his chest tighten. When he arrived, the scene hit him. Like a punch to the gut, the 5 bulldozers were lined up neatly, their massive blades gleaming under the early light. Workers bustled around checking equipment and chatting casually, as if they weren't about to demolish someone's home. Ethan parked his truck near the gate and stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel. For a moment, he just stood there taking it all in. The familiar wooden fence, the porch swing that used to creak when the wind blew, the windows that had seen so many seasons pass by. It was all still standing for now. One of the workers spotted him and approached cautiously. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his tone polite but firm. "This is my family's land," Ethan said, trying to keep his voice steady. "What are you doing here?" The worker glanced back at the bulldozers before answering. "We're prepping for demolition. Orders came from Caleb Whitmore. He said this place is getting cleared today." Ethan clenched his fists, anger bubbling beneath the surface. He wanted to scream, to tell them they couldn't touch a single board, but he knew losing his temper wouldn't solve anything. Instead, he took a deep breath and tried to reason. "Look, there's been a misunderstanding. This property belongs to me. You can't tear it down." The worker frowned, clearly uncomfortable. "I don't know anything about that. My job is to follow orders. If you've got proof, you'll need to show it to the boss." The boss was Caleb, of course. Ethan felt a wave of frustration wash over him. Even now, Caleb was pulling strings, making decisions without considering anyone else. But Ethan didn't have time to dwell on that. He needed to act fast. He walked over to the foreman, a burly man with a clipboard tucked under his arm. "Listen," Ethan began, his voice calm but urgent. "This house is part of my family's history. You can't destroy it. Not until we sort this out." The foreman raised an eyebrow. "Sort what out?" "We've got our instructions, and unless you've got something official saying otherwise, we're moving forward." Ethan hesitated. He didn't have the official paperwork yet. It was stuck somewhere in legal limbo. But he couldn't let that stop him. "You don't understand," he said, his tone growing more desperate. "This isn't just some building. This is where I grew up, where my mom raised us, where she passed away." For a brief moment, the foreman's expression softened, but then he shook his head. "I'm sorry, kid. I've got a job to do. If you've got a problem, take it up with your brother." Ethan's heart sank. He realized he couldn't rely on logic or emotion to stop them. He needed to buy himself some time. Thinking quickly, he turned to the workers. "Okay, fine. But before you start tearing anything down, I want to check the structure, make sure it's safe. Who knows what Kind of damage years of neglect might have caused. The foreman exchanged a glance with one of the other workers. That's not really our responsibility. It should be, Ethan interrupted. If something collapses while you're working, it's on you. Just give me an hour to look around, that's all I'm asking. Reluctantly, the foreman nodded. Fine, 1 hour. But after that, we're starting whether you like it or not. Ethan didn't waste a second. He hurried inside the house, his footsteps echoing through the empty halls. Everything looked exactly as he remembered. The faded wallpaper, the creaky stairs, the faint smell of wood polish lingering in the air. Memories flooded back to him, uninvited but vivid. He saw himself as a child, playing hide-and-seek with his brother. He heard his mother's voice calling them in for dinner. He even remembered the sound of rain tapping against the roof during stormy nights. But nostalgia wouldn't save the house. Ethan grabbed his phone and started snapping photos. Every room, every corner, every detail. He sent the pictures to the lawyer, hoping they'd speed up the process. Then he called a local news station, explaining the situation. He figured if people knew what was happening, maybe they'd step in to help. By the time he returned outside, a small crowd had gathered. Neighbors, curious about the commotion, had come to see what was going on. Some recognized Ethan and greeted him warmly. Others whispered among themselves, speculating about why bulldozers were parked outside the beloved Whitmore home. One elderly woman stepped forward, her face lined with concern. "Is it true?" she asked. "Are they really going to tear this place down?" Ethan nodded grimly. "They're planning to, yes, but it's not theirs to destroy." The woman shook her head. "This house has been here longer than most of us. It's part of the town's soul. You can't let them take that away." Her words struck a chord with the others. Soon, voices rose in protest, demanding answers from the workers. Someone recorded a video and posted it online. Within minutes, the story began spreading like wildfire. People who had never met Ethan were sharing posts, commenting on how heartbreaking it was to see such a historic home threatened. Back at the construction site, tension simmered. The workers looked uneasy, unsure of what to do. The foreman barked, orders trying to keep everyone focused, but it was clear the tide was turning. Ethan watched silently, feeling a mix of hope and dread. He knew the attention would put pressure on Caleb, but it also meant confronting his brother sooner rather than later. As the clock ticked closer to the 1 hour mark, Ethan braced himself. He didn't know what would happen next. But one thing was certain: he wasn't giving up without a fight. The house wasn't just a pile of bricks and beams. It was a symbol of everything his family had built, fought for, and cherished. And if Caleb thought he could erase that, he was dead wrong. Little did Ethan know the battle was only beginning. Ethan stood near the gate, his hands shoved deep into his pockets as he watched the crowd grow. The air buzzed with energy. People were talking loudly, some arguing with the workers, others snapping pictures or recording videos on their phones. A couple of teenagers had even climbed onto the fence to get a better view. It was chaos, but it was organized chaos, driven by a shared sense of purpose. Everyone there wanted to protect the house. The foreman looked increasingly agitated. He kept glancing at his watch, clearly torn between following orders and dealing with the growing resistance. Finally, he barked at one of the workers. "Call Caleb. Tell him we've got a situation here." Ethan's stomach churned at the mention of his brother's name. He knew this moment was inevitable. Sooner or later, Caleb would show up, and when he did, things would escalate. Ethan wasn't ready for that confrontation. Not yet, but he didn't have a choice. Every second counted. As if on cue, a black SUV roared down the dirt road, kicking up clouds of dust behind it. It screeched to a halt near the bulldozers, and out stepped Caleb Whitmore. Tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing an expensive suit that seemed wildly out of place in the middle of a construction site, Caleb surveyed the scene with narrowed eyes. His jaw tightened when he spotted Ethan standing among the crowd. "What the hell is going on here?" Caleb demanded, his voice cutting through the noise like a knife. The workers immediately fell silent, stepping back instinctively. Even the townsfolk hesitated, unsure how to respond to the man who practically owned half the businesses in town. Ethan stepped forward, his heart pounding, but his expression steady. "You tell me, Caleb. Why are you trying to tear down our family home?" Caleb scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest. "Our family home? Don't make me laugh. You haven't cared about this place in years. And besides, Mom left everything to me. This land is mine now." Ethan shook his head, gripping the straps of his backpack tighter. "That's not true. She changed her will before she passed. Everything, the house, the land, it all belongs to me." For a moment, Caleb just stared at him, his face unreadable. Then he laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that sent chills down Ethan's spine. "Nice try, little brother, but I don't believe you. If Mom had changed her will, I would have known about it. You're just making things up because you can't stand seeing me succeed." The accusation stung, but Ethan refused to let it show. Instead, he pulled out his phone and held it up so Caleb could see the messages from the lawyer. "I'm not lying. Here's proof. The paperwork is still being processed, but it's real. This place is legally mine." Caleb snatched the phone out of Ethan's hand, scrolling through the messages with a frown. His confidence wavered slightly, but he quickly masked it with anger. "This doesn't mean anything. Until the documents are official, I'm still in charge. And I say we move forward with the demolition." The crowd erupted in protests. Voices shouted from every direction, "Leave the house alone. It's part of our history. How dare you destroy something so precious?" Caleb ignored them, focusing instead on Ethan. "You think you can stop me? Go ahead, try. But you'll lose. Just like you always do." Ethan clenched his fists, struggling to keep his temper in check. He hated how easily Caleb could push his buttons, how effortlessly he dismissed everything Ethan cared about. But losing, control wouldn't help. Not now. "I'm not backing down," Ethan said firmly. "If you try to tear this place down, I'll fight you every step of the way." Caleb smirked, clearly unimpressed. "Fine. Have it your way. But don't come crying to me when this whole mess blows up in your face." With that, Caleb turned on his heel and marched back to his SUV. Before getting in, he yelled at the foreman, "Keep things moving. We're not stopping for anyone." The workers exchanged uneasy glances. They didn't want to be caught in the middle of a family feud, especially one that was drawing so much attention. One of them muttered under his breath, "This isn't worth it." Ethan seized the opportunity. "Listen," he called out, raising his voice so everyone could hear. "I know you're just doing your jobs, but think about what you're destroying. This house has been here for generations. It's part of who we are. Do you really want to be the ones responsible for wiping that away?" His words resonated with the crowd, and several people nodded in agreement. Someone shouted, "Yeah, leave it alone." Another added, "We should call the mayor." The tension escalated as the workers debated among themselves. Some argued that they couldn't risk ignoring Caleb's orders, while others insisted they couldn't justify demolishing a piece of local history. In the midst of the argument, a police car arrived, its lights flashing silently. Two officers stepped out, surveying the scene with wary expressions. "What's going on here?" one of them asked, addressing the foreman. Before anyone could answer, Ethan spoke up. "Officer, these men are planning to demolish a historic property without proper authorization. I'm the legal owner and I haven't given permission for this." The foreman cut in angrily. "That's not true. We have clearance from Caleb Whitmore, who owns the company funding this project." The officer held up a hand to quiet them, both. All right. Let's take this one step at a time. Does anyone have documentation proving ownership?" Ethan pointed to his phone, which Caleb had dropped on the ground during their earlier exchange. "The proof is right there. My lawyer is processing the official papers. But my mother's will clearly states that I inherit everything." The officer picked up the phone and scrolled through the messages carefully. After a few moments, he looked at Ethan and then at Caleb, who had returned from his SUV to intervene. "Until we verify the legal status of this property, no demolition work can proceed. Is that understood?" Caleb bristled, his face turning red with fury. "This is ridiculous. You're letting him stall us because of some stupid will? This is business, not some sentimental sob story." The officer remained calm but firm. Rules are rules, sir. Unless you can provide concrete evidence that you own this property, we can't allow any further action today. Defeated, for... Now Caleb stormed off, slamming the door of his SUV as he drove away. The workers packed up their equipment reluctantly, knowing they couldn't defy the law. As the bulldozers rumbled off the property, the crowd erupted in cheers. Strangers patted Ethan on the back, congratulating him for standing his ground. But Ethan didn't feel triumphant. He knew this was only a temporary victory. Caleb wouldn't give up that easily, and until the paperwork was finalized, the threat to the house and to his family's legacy remained very real. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard, Ethan walked slowly toward the front porch. He sat down, on the steps, staring at the house he'd fought so hard to save. For the first time in years, he felt connected to it again, to the memories, the laughter, the love that had once filled its walls. But he also felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. Saving the house was just the beginning. Rebuilding trust with his brother, with himself, with the community, would be the hardest part of all. And somewhere deep inside, Ethan wondered if Caleb would ever understand why this place mattered so much, or if their fractured relationship could ever truly be repaired. The days following the standoff at the house were a blur of activity for Ethan. He spent every waking moment chasing down paperwork, meeting with lawyers and fielding calls from reporters who couldn't get enough of the family feud turned viral sensation. His phone buzzed constantly, texts, emails, voicemails, all demanding answers or updates. But despite the chaos, Ethan refused to lose focus. This wasn't just about saving a building. It was about proving something, to himself, to Caleb, and to everyone watching. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the official documents arrived. Ethan held them in his hands, feeling the weight of the crisp paper as if it carried the hopes of generations. It was real now. Legal. Irrefutable. The house belonged to him. Not Caleb. Not the bulldozers. Him. But before he could celebrate, Ethan knew there was one more hurdle to clear. Confronting Caleb face to face. They hadn't spoken since that tense exchange on the property, and Ethan dreaded the thought of sitting across from his brother again. Still, he owed it to himself and to their mother to make sure Caleb understood the truth. He called Caleb's office, leaving a terse message asking him to meet at the house. To his surprise, Caleb agreed without hesitation. Maybe he sensed the inevitability of this moment too. Or maybe he just wanted to settle things once and for all. Either way, Ethan braced himself for the storm ahead. When Caleb arrived, he looked different somehow. Gone was the slick confidence, replaced by a weariness that made him seem older than his years. He climbed out of his truck slowly, his eyes scanning the property with a mix of curiosity and regret. For a moment, neither brother said anything, the silence between them thick enough to cut with a knife. "You wanted to talk?" Caleb finally broke the quiet, his tone clipped but not hostile. Ethan nodded, holding up the envelope containing the legal papers. "I got the final documents today. I thought you deserved to see them." Caleb hesitated, then stepped closer. "Fine, let's see it." Ethan handed over the folder, watching as Caleb flipped through the pages. At first, his expression remained unreadable, a mask of practiced indifference. But as he reached the last page, his shoulders sagged slightly. He stared at the signature at the bottom, unmistakably their mother's handwriting. Then he closed the folder and let out a long, shaky breath. "I didn't know," Caleb admitted quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "She never told me she changed her will." Ethan crossed his arms, trying to keep his emotions in check. "She did, right before she passed. She wanted me to have the house." Caleb shook his head, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. "Why? Why would she leave it to you? You haven't been around in years. You weren't even part of the business." Ethan flinched at the accusation but forced himself to stay calm. "Maybe that's exactly why she chose me. Because I wasn't caught up in all the ambition, all the plans to tear things down and build something new. Mom loved this house, Caleb. She didn't want to see it destroyed." "That's not fair," Caleb snapped, his anger bubbling to the surface. You think I wanted to destroy it? I just saw potential. A chance to create jobs, bring in revenue, do something meaningful for the town. Meaningful? Ethan shot back, his own frustration boiling over. Destroying the only thing left of our childhood is supposed to be meaningful? That house isn't just wood and nails, it's memories. It's us. And you were ready to erase it like it meant nothing. Caleb opened his mouth to argue but stopped short. Instead, he sank onto the porch steps, burying his face in his hands. For the first time in years, Ethan saw vulnerability in his brother, the kind of raw emotion that reminded him they were still family no matter how far apart they'd drifted. I messed up, Caleb muttered, his voice heavy with guilt. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was carrying on Dad's legacy, building something bigger, better. But maybe I lost sight of what really mattered along the way. Ethan sat beside him, unsure of what to say. The anger he'd carried for so long began to soften, replaced by a pang of sympathy. Caleb wasn't perfect, he never had been, but neither was Ethan. Maybe they'd both been wrong in their own ways. Their mother's letter lay tucked inside the envelope, untouched until now. Ethan pulled it out carefully and handed it to Caleb. Read this, he said softly. It explains everything. Caleb unfolded the letter, his hands trembling slightly as he scanned the words. Their mother's voice came alive on the page, filled with love, wisdom, and regret. She wrote about how proud she was of both her sons, but how worried she'd become about the path Caleb had chosen. About how Ethan, though distant, had always stayed true to the values she'd tried to instill in them, and most importantly, about why she'd decided to leave the house to Ethan. She trusted you, Caleb said when he finished reading, his voice thick with emotion. She believed you'd protect this place. Ethan nodded, blinking back tears. Yeah. And I plan to, but not alone. If you're willing, I'd like your help. Caleb looked at him, startled. You mean, after everything? It's not about punishing you, Ethan replied firmly. It's about moving forward. Together. This house doesn't belong to either of us. It belongs to our family, to everyone who's ever cared about it. And if we work together, we can make it something special again. For a long moment, Caleb didn't respond. He stared at the house, his jaw working as if he were wrestling with some internal battle. Then, slowly, he nodded. Okay, he said. Let's fix it. Together. As the brothers stood side by side, looking at the old house bathed in golden afternoon light, a sense of possibility settled over them. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. They'd need to rebuild trust as much as they'd need to rebuild walls. But for the first time in years, they felt hopeful. Hopeful that maybe, just maybe, they could restore not only the house but also the bond they'd nearly lost forever. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard, Ethan realized something important. The hardest battles aren't fought against others, they're fought within ourselves. Forgiveness wasn't just for Caleb, it was for him too. And with that realization, he took a step closer to healing, not just for the house, but for their fractured family. Months had passed since the standoff at the family home, and life in the small town had settled into a new rhythm. The Bulldozers were long gone, their menacing presence replaced by the steady hum of hammers, saws, and laughter. What was once a battleground now felt like a place of healing, a testament to what could happen when people came together for something bigger than themselves. Ethan stood on the porch, watching as volunteers worked tirelessly to restore the old house. The roof had been patched up, the windows replaced, and fresh paint gave the exterior a warm glow it hadn't seen in years. Inside, the floors creaked less, the walls were sturdy again, and the musty smell of neglect had been replaced by the scent of freshly cut wood and varnish. It wasn't perfect yet, but it was alive again, just like Ethan himself. At first, he'd tried to do everything alone. He'd spent hours scraping away peeling wallpaper, sanding down warped floorboards, and fixing broken fixtures. But soon, word spread about his efforts. and help started pouring in from unexpected places. Neighbors brought tools, food, and stories about how much the house meant to them. Friends of his parents showed up with old photographs and memorabilia, eager to share memories of days gone by. Even former employees of the Whitmore family business pitched in, saying they wanted to honor the legacy of the woman who had always treated them like family. But perhaps the most surprising helper of all was Caleb. It hadn't happened overnight. After the demolition was halted, Caleb had disappeared for weeks, refusing to answer Ethan's calls or even acknowledge him. Rumors swirled around town that Caleb was furious, not just because he'd lost control of the property, but because he felt betrayed by their mother's decision. For someone who prided himself on being in charge, this was a blow to his pride. One evening, though, Caleb showed up unannounced at the house. Ethan was sitting on the porch nursing a cup of coffee when he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. He looked up to see his brother stepping out of his truck, looking tired and worn in a way Ethan hadn't noticed before. Gone was the sharp suit and polished shoes. Instead, Caleb wore jeans and a flannel shirt that made him look almost approachable. "What are you doing here?" Ethan asked cautiously, setting his mug aside. Caleb hesitated, running a hand through his hair. I don't know. I guess I needed to see it for myself." Ethan gestured toward the house. "Well, here it is, still standing." Caleb let out a dry laugh. "Yeah, I can see that." He paused, glancing around at the workers and volunteers bustling about. "I didn't think you'd actually go through with it. Fixing this place, I mean." "Neither did I," Ethan admitted. "But once people heard what was happening, they wouldn't let me give up. Turns out this house means more to folks than I realized." Caleb nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on the front door. "Do you remember when we used to race each other down those stairs? You always cheated grabbing onto the railing." A faint smile tugged at Ethan's lips. "And you always complained, but Mom never took your side." For a moment they both fell silent, lost in memories of a simpler time. Then Caleb cleared, his throat, his voice softer now. "Look, Ethan, I owe you an apology. For a lot of things. I shouldn't have assumed the house was mine. And I definitely shouldn't have tried to tear it down without knowing the truth." Ethan studied his brother carefully. There was no arrogance in Caleb's expression, no defensiveness, just raw honesty. It was strange seeing him like this, vulnerable and unsure. "Apology accepted," Ethan said finally. "But you need to understand why this place matters so much to me, to all of us." "I do now," Caleb replied quietly. "After Mom died, I thought selling the land would be the best way to honor her memory, to turn it into something profitable, something that could grow. But I realize now that I was wrong. This house isn't just a building, it's who we are." The two brothers stood there for a while longer, neither saying anything. Eventually, Caleb spoke again. "So, what can I do to help?" Ethan raised an eyebrow, surprised but grateful. "You sure about this?" "Yeah," Caleb said with a shrug. "Might as well start making up for lost time." From that day on, Caleb became a regular fixture at the house. At first, he stuck to smaller tasks, painting trim, carrying supplies, organizing materials. But as the weeks went by, he grew more comfortable, taking on bigger projects and working alongside Ethan without hesitation. They talked as they worked, sharing stories they hadn't told each other in years. Slowly, the walls between them began to crumble, just like the ones they were rebuilding. As the restoration neared completion, Ethan and Caleb decided to transform part of the property into something special, a heritage museum dedicated to their family's history. Old photographs lined the walls along with letters, artifacts, and mementos donated by friends and neighbors. A corner of the barn was turned into a community space where locals could gather for events and workshops. It wasn't just about preserving the past. It was about creating a future rooted in connection and shared values. On the day of the grand reopening, the entire town turned out to celebrate. Families strolled through the museum, marveling at the displays. Children laughed as they played tag in the yard. while adults reminisced about their own experiences with the Whitmore family. Ethan stood near the entrance, shaking hands and thanking everyone who had helped bring the house back to life. Caleb stood beside him, looking genuinely happy for the first time in years. "You know," he said, leaning against the railing, "I used to think success was all about money and power. But seeing this, it makes me realize there's more to it than that." Ethan smiled. "Yeah, I get that. Sometimes you have to lose everything to figure out what really matters." As the sun set over the horizon, casting a golden glow across the property, Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. The house wasn't just saved. It was reborn, not only as a symbol, a family, but also of forgiveness, resilience, and hope. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt like he belonged somewhere again. He glanced at Caleb, who was chatting with a group of neighbors, laughing at some joke they'd shared. Maybe their relationship would never be perfect, but it didn't have to be. All that mattered was that they were trying, and that was enough. 1 year later, the Whitmore family home stood as a beacon of renewal and unity. The once dilapidated house was now a vibrant centerpiece of the community, its weathered exterior restored to its former glory. Fresh white paint gleamed under the sun, while flower boxes brimming with colorful blooms adorned every window. Inside, the rooms were filled with warmth. Photos on the walls told stories of generations past, and handmade quilts draped over furniture gave it a cozy, lived-in feel. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a living, breathing testament to what could be achieved when people came together. The day of the grand unveiling had finally arrived. Ethan stood at the entrance, clutching a pair of keys in his hand. Behind him, a crowd of townsfolk gathered, chatting excitedly as they waited for the ceremony to begin. Children darted between adults, chasing each other around the yard, while elderly neighbors sat on folding chairs, smiling at the sight of something so familiar yet transformed. Caleb lingered nearby, leaning against a post, watching silently, but clearly proud of what they'd accomplished together. A local pastor stepped forward to say a few words, his voice warm and steady. "This house represents more than bricks and mortar," he began. "It's a symbol of love, resilience, and the power of forgiveness. Today, we celebrate not just a building, but the spirit of this community, and the Whitmore family who made it all possible." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. He hadn't expected such heartfelt praise, but hearing those words reminded him of how far they'd come. Just a year ago, this place had been on the brink of destruction, both physically and emotionally. Now it stood tall, not just as a reminder of the past, but as a promise for the future. When the pastor finished speaking, Ethan took a deep breath and stepped up to address the crowd. For a moment, he hesitated, overwhelmed by the sea of faces, looking back at him. Then he smiled softly and began to speak. "I never thought I'd stand here today," he admitted, his voice trembling slightly. "Not long ago, this house was nearly torn down. And honestly, part of me wondered if it was worth saving. But then I remembered why it mattered, not because of the walls or the roof, but because of the memories inside, because of my mom, who taught us what it meant to care for one another, and because of everyone here, who showed me that no matter how broken things seem, we can always find a way to rebuild." He paused, glancing at Caleb, who nodded encouragingly. "None of this would have been possible without my brother." "Yeah, we've had our differences," Ethan added with a wry grin, earning a ripple of laughter from the audience. "But in the end, we realized we're stronger together. So thank you, Caleb, for stepping up when it mattered most." Caleb walked over and clapped Ethan on the shoulder, his expression uncharacteristically soft. "No, thank you," he said firmly. "You saved this place, not just for us, but for everyone. I couldn't have done it without you." The two brothers shared a brief but meaningful look before Ethan turned back to the crowd. "And thank all of you," he continued. "Every single person here played a part in bringing this house back to life. Whether you hammered nails, painted walls, donated supplies, or simply spread the word, you helped restore something much bigger than any one of us." With that, Ethan held up the keys and handed them ceremoniously to Caleb. "This house belongs To all of us now, he said. But since you helped carry the load, I think it's only fitting that you get to unlock the door. Caleb hesitated, clearly caught off guard. Then with a small smile, he accepted the keys and stepped toward the front door. As he turned the lock and pushed the door open, the crowd erupted into applause. People cheered, whistled, and clapped, their joy echoing across the property. It was a moment none of them would forget, a celebration of hard work, determination, and the bonds that held them together. Inside, the house buzzed with energy as visitors explored every corner. The museum section drew the most attention, with kids pressing their noses against glass cases to get a closer look at old letters and photographs. In the kitchen, volunteers served homemade pies and lemonade, filling the air with the sweet aroma of baked goods. Laughter and conversation flowed freely, creating an atmosphere of pure happiness. As the festivities wound down, Ethan found himself standing alone in the living room. The room was quiet now, save for the faint creak of floorboards as people moved upstairs. He glanced at the fireplace where he used to sit with his mother during cold winter nights. Her favorite chair still sat in the same spot, though it had been reupholstered in a cheerful floral pattern. For a moment, he closed his eyes, imagining her sitting there, smiling at him. "You did good, kiddo," a voice said behind him. Ethan turned to see Caleb leaning against the doorway holding 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Ethan and raised his own in a mock toast. "To Mom," he said simply. "To Mom," Ethan echoed, clinking his cup against Caleb's. They stood there for a while, sipping their drinks in companionable silence. There was no need for words, not after everything they'd been through. Later, that evening as the last guests left and the house grew quiet, Ethan wandered outside. The stars were out in full force, painting the sky with shimmering light. He leaned against the porch railing, letting the cool night air wash over him. Despite everything, the fights, the doubts, the struggles, he felt at peace. Behind him, the house loomed large and sturdy, a testament to what could be achieved when people chose to fight for something greater than themselves. It wasn't perfect. Of course, some boards still creaked, some windows rattled in the wind, and the paint would eventually fade again. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the love and effort poured into every inch of it, the kind of legacy that couldn't be measured in dollars or square footage. As Ethan gazed at the darkened horizon, he thought about the road ahead. There would be challenges, of course. Life had a way of throwing curveballs when least expected, but for the first time in years, he felt ready to face whatever came next. Together, he and Caleb had rebuilt more than just a house. They'd rebuilt their relationship, their trust, and their hope for the future. And as he stepped back inside, closing the door gently behind him, Ethan knew one thing for certain. The Whitmore name wouldn't just survive, it would thrive. Not because of wealth or power, but because of the values they'd chosen to uphold. Love, forgiveness, and the courage to start over. That was the true legacy worth preserving.